October 14th, 1947, 9:15 in the morning. Captain Chuck Yeager gritted his teeth against searing pain as he tried to lift his right arm inside the cramped cockpit of the Bell X-1. Two broken ribs screamed in protest with every movement, every breath. The local doctor had been crystal clear just 2 hours earlier. Absolutely no flying, no sudden movements, complete rest for at least 2 weeks. Yet here he sat, strapped into an experimental rocket plane hanging in the bomb bay of a B-29 bomber at 25,000 feet, about to attempt what many believed was impossible, what some said would kill any pilot who tried it. The pain shot through his right side like hot needles as the bomber climbed toward release altitude. Every bump of turbulence sent fresh waves of agony through his chest. He couldn't even reach across his body to close the cockpit door properly, a problem that should have grounded the mission immediately. But Chuck Yeager had not come this far, had not hidden his injury from his superiors for 2 days, had not risked his entire career just to turn back now. The sound barrier loomed ahead like an invisible wall in the sky, a deadly phenomenon that had already claimed lives and destroyed aircraft. Test pilots called it the demon that lived at Mach 1. Engineers warned it might be an impenetrable barrier that would tear any aircraft to pieces. And Yeager was about to charge straight at it with 2 broken ribs that made every movement agony, unable to properly secure his own cockpit. This is the story of the most important 10 minutes in aviation history, when one man's determination to fly through unbearable pain would change the world forever. If you're fascinated by these incredible moments when human willpower defeats the impossible, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Old Breed channel, because the details of what happened next will leave you stunned. 2 days earlier, on the evening of October 12th, Yeager had been riding horses with his wife Glennis at Pancho Barnes's Happy Bottom Riding Club, the infamous desert ranch near Muroc Army Airfield in California's Mojave Desert. The evening ride was supposed to be relaxing, a brief escape from the mounting pressure of the X-1 program. The couple had challenged each other to a race back to the corral as darkness fell across the desert. Yeager couldn't see the gate clearly in the fading light. His horse saw it, though, and stopped abruptly. Newton's first law took over. Yeager kept going, flying over the horse's head and slamming into the wooden gate with brutal force. The impact knocked him unconscious for several moments. When he came to, gasping in the dust, he knew immediately something was very wrong. The right side of his chest felt like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. Glennis wanted to take him straight to the base hospital, but Yeager knew exactly what would happen if he showed up there with broken ribs 2 days before the most important flight in aviation history. The flight surgeons would ground him instantly. Colonel Albert Boyd would have no choice but to replace him. Another pilot would get the chance to break the sound barrier. Everything Yeager had worked for, all the dangerous test flights that had brought him to this moment, would be for nothing. Instead, he convinced Glennis to drive him to a local veterinarian in the nearby town of Rosamond. The elderly doctor confirmed what Yeager already knew. 2 ribs on his right side were broken. The doctor taped them up as best he could and gave him the predictable advice. No strenuous activity, no sudden movements, definitely no flying. Rest for at least 2 weeks. Yeager nodded, paid the man, and never intended to follow a single word of that advice. The next morning, October 13th, Yeager showed up at Muroc as if nothing had happened. He attended the mission briefing, reviewed the flight plan, and somehow managed to hide his injury from everyone. But that night, alone in his room, the reality of his situation hit him. He could barely lift his right arm. How was he going to fly the X-1? More critically, how was he going to close and lock the cockpit door? The X-1's cockpit door was a particular problem. It wasn't like the canopy on a normal fighter plane. The door was on the right side of the fuselage, and it had to be pulled closed from inside using a handle, then locked with a lever that required significant force to engage. With his broken ribs, Yeager couldn't reach across his body with his left hand, and he couldn't lift his right arm high enough to grab the handle. On the morning of October 14th, with just hours to go before the flight, Yeager finally confided in one person: Jack Ridley, the X-1 project engineer and one of his closest friends. Ridley was a brilliant problem solver, an aeronautical engineer who understood both the technical and human sides of test flying. When Yeager showed him the problem in the X-1 cockpit that morning, Ridley didn't lecture him about the insanity of flying with broken ribs. He didn't threaten to tell Colonel Boyd. Instead, he disappeared for 10 minutes. Ridley came back with a 9-inch piece of broomstick. "Use this," he said simply. "Hook it onto the door handle. You can pull it closed with your left hand and get enough leverage to lock it." It was absurdly simple. A piece of broomstick from a janitor's closet would enable the most important flight in aviation history. Yeager tested it carefully. The pain was still excruciating, but it worked. He could close and lock the door. At 7 a.m., Yeager attended the final weather briefing. The conditions were perfect: clear skies, minimal wind, excellent visibility. There would be no weather excuse to postpone. At 8 a.m., he climbed into the B-29 mothership, nicknamed Fertile Myrtle, that would carry the X-1 to altitude. Every step up the ladder sent lightning bolts of pain through his chest. The X-1 hung in the bomb bay like a bright orange bullet. Officially designated the Bell X-1, Yeager had painted "Glamorous Glennis" on the nose in honor of his wife, the same woman who had driven him to a veterinarian instead of the base hospital 2 nights earlier. The rocket plane was just 31 feet long with a wingspan of only 28 feet. It looked more like a bullet with stubby wings than a conventional aircraft. As Fertile Myrtle climbed through 15,000 feet, Yeager prepared to transfer from the bomber to the X-1. This was always the most dangerous part of the flight preparation. He had to climb down a ladder from the B-29's bomb bay into the X-1's cockpit while both aircraft were flying at over 200 miles per hour. One slip, one moment of weakness from the pain, and he would fall to his death. 20,000 feet. The temperature in the bomb bay was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeager's breath came in painful gasps that sent fresh agony through his broken ribs. He began his descent down the ladder. His right hand was almost useless. He had to rely entirely on his left hand and his legs to keep him secured to the ladder. The X-1's cockpit was just feet away, but it might as well have been miles. His boots found the X-1's cockpit. Now came the hard part. He had to lower himself inside while the broken ribs screamed in protest. Every instinct told him to stop, to climb back up, to abort the mission. Instead, he gritted his teeth and dropped into the seat. Now for Ridley's broomstick. Yeager pulled it from his flight suit and hooked it onto the door handle. Pulling with his left hand, he managed to swing the door closed. Another agonizing effort to engage the lock. It clicked into place. He was sealed inside the X-1 at 23,000 feet, committed now to either making history or dying in the attempt. Bob Cardenas, piloting the B-29, took them up to 25,000 feet. This was the drop altitude. In the X-1, Yeager went through his pre-flight checklist. Every switch, every gauge, every control had to be verified. The 4 chambers of the rocket engine behind him contained a volatile mixture of liquid oxygen and alcohol that could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball with the slightest malfunction. 1 minute to drop, Cardenas announced over the radio. Yeager's pulse hammered. The broken ribs seemed to throb with each heartbeat. He forced himself to focus. Everything he had learned in hundreds of test flights, all his combat experience from World War II when he had shot down 13 German aircraft, including 5 in a single day, all of it came down to the next 10 minutes. 10 seconds, Cardenas called. Yeager took a deep breath, sending fresh pain through his chest. His left hand gripped the control stick. His feet rested on the rudder pedals. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, drop. The X-1 fell away from the B-29 like a stone. For a moment, Yeager was in free fall, weightless despite the pain. Then he hit the switches for chambers 1 and 3 of the rocket engine. The X-1 lurched forward with incredible force, pressing him back into his seat. The acceleration was so violent it actually helped with the pain. He was pushed so hard into the seat he couldn't move enough to hurt. The Mach-meter climbed rapidly. 0.7 Mach, 0.8, 0.85. This was where things had gone wrong before. As aircraft approached the speed of sound, shock waves formed on the wings and control surfaces. The controls would buffer violently. Some aircraft had simply torn apart. Others had gone into uncontrollable dives. 0.9 Mach. The X-1 began to shake. This was expected, but it didn't make it less terrifying. The control stick started buffeting in Yeager's hand. Through the pain of his ribs, he had to maintain precise control, making tiny adjustments to keep the aircraft stable. 0.92 Mach. The buffeting intensified. It felt like the X-1 was coming apart. Previous flights had reported that the closer they got to Mach 1, the worse the buffeting became. Some engineers believed this proved the sound barrier was indeed a barrier, that the buffeting would increase until it destroyed any aircraft that tried to penetrate it. 0.94 Mach. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. The buffeting began to decrease. The control stick, which had been shaking violently in Yeager's hand, began to smooth out. This made no sense according to the prevailing theories. 0.96 Mach. The X-1 was now smoother than it had been at 0.9. Yeager's combat instincts, honed over 50 combat missions in World War II, told him to trust what he was feeling, not what the engineers predicted. He fired chamber 2 of the rocket engine. The additional thrust pushed him harder into his seat. 0.98 Mach. The needle on the Mach meter moved toward the right side of the gauge. In 1947, no one had built a Mach meter that could register speeds above Mach 1. They didn't think they would need to. 0.99 Mach. The X-1 was now traveling at approximately 760 miles per hour, the speed of sound at 43,000 feet. The desert floor was 8 miles below. If the aircraft came apart now, Yeager would have maybe 90 seconds to live, 90 seconds of falling while broken ribs made it impossible to breathe. And then it happened. The needle on the Mach meter fluctuated, then jumped off the scale. The X-1 had exceeded Mach 1. But instead of the predicted catastrophic failure, instead of the aircraft tearing itself apart, something remarkable occurred. The ride became smooth as glass. All buffeting ceased. The demon that lived at Mach 1, the invisible barrier that had terrified pilots and killed men, simply wasn't there. Yeager pushed the X-1 to Mach 1.06, approximately 700 miles per hour. He was flying faster than sound itself. His own voice, if he could have shouted outside the cockpit, would have been left behind. He was experiencing something no human being had ever experienced before. The sonic boom rolled across the Mojave Desert like thunder. The ground crew at Murach heard it and knew immediately what it meant. Someone in the X-1 program had just made history. They wouldn't know for certain it was successful until Yeager landed, but that distinctive double crack of a sonic boom told them someone had punched through the barrier. For 14 minutes, Yeager flew the X-1 in the supersonic realm. He tested the controls, gathering data that would revolutionize aviation. The aircraft handled beautifully above Mach 1. All the fears about the sound barrier being an impenetrable wall were wrong. It was more like a door, difficult to push through, but once you were on the other side, a whole new world of flight opened up. As the rocket fuel ran low, Yeager began his descent. Slowing back through the sound barrier, the buffeting returned briefly, then smoothed out as he dropped below Mach 0.8. The X-1 was a glider now, its rocket fuel exhausted. Yeager would have to dead-stick it onto the dry lakebed at Mach, landing without power at over 200 miles per hour. The broken ribs, which adrenaline had helped him ignore during the powered flight, now reasserted themselves with vengeance. Every control input sent fresh waves of pain through his chest. The lakebed rushed up to meet him. 100 feet, 50 feet, 20 feet. The X-1 touched down at 190 miles per hour, rolling across the hard-packed desert floor. Yeager let it run, gently applying the brakes. The aircraft rolled to a stop 2 miles from touchdown. He had done it, despite broken ribs, despite the pain, despite the doctor's orders. He had broken the sound barrier. But now came another challenge. He had to get out of the X-1 without revealing his injury. The ground crew was already racing toward him in jeeps and trucks. He used the broomstick again, this time to push the door open. Climbing out required every ounce of willpower he possessed. He managed to drop to the ground and remain standing, though the impact sent agony shooting through his entire right side. Jack Ridley reached him first, a knowing look in his eyes. "How was it?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Piece of cake," Yeager replied, managing his characteristic grin despite the pain. The military kept the flight classified for 8 months. When the news finally broke in June 1948, Chuck Yeager became a national hero. But even then, the story of the broken ribs remained secret for years. Yeager himself didn't publicly reveal it until much later, understanding that admitting to flying in that condition would have ended his test pilot career immediately. What Yeager had proven on October 14, 1947, went far beyond just breaking the sound barrier. He had shown that the greatest obstacles to human achievement are often psychological, not physical. The sound barrier had been built up in pilots' minds as an unsurmountable wall. The broken ribs should have been an insurmountable physical limitation. Yet Yeager had overcome both through a combination of skill, determination, and simple refusal to accept limitations. The data from Yeager's flight revolutionized aviation. Within a year, several aircraft were routinely flying faster than sound. The supersonic age had begun, leading directly to the development of jet fighters that could exceed Mach 2, commercial aircraft like the Concorde, and eventually the space shuttle, which would need to master supersonic flight to return from orbit. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of that October morning was the mundane nature of the solution to Yeager's problem. A 9-inch piece of broomstick, probably worth less than a nickel, had enabled the most significant aviation breakthrough of the 20th century. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest achievements don't require complex technology or perfect conditions. Sometimes they just require the determination to find a way, any way, to keep going. The broken ribs healed, of course. Yeager went on to fly the X-1 faster and faster, eventually reaching Mach 2.4 in later aircraft. He flew combat missions again in Vietnam, commanded fighter squadrons, and became the most famous test pilot in history. But he would always say that no flight ever matched the intensity of that morning over the Mojave, when he flew through searing pain to prove that the only real barriers are the ones we accept. The broomstick that made it all possible? It became one of the most famous pieces of wood in aviation history, Some say it should have been in the Smithsonian next to the Spirit of St. Louis. Instead, in typical Yeager fashion, it was probably thrown away after the flight, its job done, its place in history secured by its absence rather than its preservation. Think about that for a moment. The sound barrier, that demon that lived at Mach 1, that killer of test pilots, was defeated by a man with broken ribs using a piece of broomstick. Every supersonic flight since then, every fighter jet that breaks the sound barrier, every spacecraft that punches through the atmosphere owes something to that morning when Chuck Yeager proved that determination matters more than perfect conditions. The doctor who examined Yeager 2 days before the flight had been right about one thing. Flying with broken ribs was dangerous, painful, and medically inadvisable. But the doctor hadn't factored in the kind of person who becomes a test pilot, the kind of person who had shot down 5 enemy aircraft in a single day during World War II, the kind of person who would rather risk everything than miss the chance to make history. When news of the broken ribs finally became public years later, people asked Yeager why he had risked it. Why hadn't he waited 2 weeks for the ribs to heal? His answer was simple and revealing. He knew other pilots were close to breaking the barrier. The British were working on their own supersonic aircraft. Another test pilot in the American program could have been given his slot. In aviation, especially test aviation, there are no second-place medals for historic achievements. You're either first or you're forgotten. But there was something else, something Yeager would only admit decades later. He had been afraid that if he didn't fly that day, if he let the pain stop him, he might never get back in the cockpit of the X-1. Fear has a way of growing when you feed it with delay. The broken ribs would heal, but the doubt might not. Better to fly through the pain than live with the regret. The mission planners and engineers who later analyzed the flight data were stunned by what Yeager had accomplished. Flying the X-1 required precise control inputs, especially near the sound barrier, where the slightest mistake could cause loss of control. The fact that he had done it while unable to move his right arm properly, while every breath sent stabbing pain through his chest, seemed impossible. Yet the data was undeniable. Not only had Yeager broken the sound barrier, but he had gathered some of the cleanest, most useful test data the program had ever seen. His flying had been textbook perfect, each maneuver executed exactly as planned. Pain, it seemed, had actually sharpened his focus rather than diminishing it. The other test pilots in the program had mixed reactions when they eventually learned about the injury. Some were amazed by Yeager's toughness. Others were angry that he had risked not just his own life, but potentially the entire X-1 program. If he had crashed because of his injury, it might have set back supersonic research by years. But all of them understood the drive that had made him do it. In the brotherhood of test pilots, the chance to be first, to push the envelope further than anyone had pushed it before, was worth almost any risk. October 14th, 1947, stands as one of those rare moments when human history pivoted. Before that morning, humanity was trapped below the speed of sound. After Yeager's 14-minute flight, the entire universe of supersonic and eventually hypersonic flight opened up. The path to space itself ran through that invisible barrier Yeager penetrated at 43,000 feet over the Mojave. Today, military pilots break the sound barrier routinely. It's so common that most don't even think about it, just another number on the airspeed indicator. But every one of them owes a debt to that morning when Chuck Yeager, held together with medical tape and determination, proved it could be done. The Bell X-1, glamorous Glennis, now hangs in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., right next to Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis. Millions of visitors see it every year. Most have no idea that the man who flew it into history could barely move his right arm, that closing the cockpit door required a piece of broomstick, that every breath during that historic flight was agony. And perhaps that's the real lesson of October 14th, 1947. The greatest achievements often come not when conditions are perfect, but when someone decides that the goal is worth pursuing regardless of the obstacles. Yeager didn't break the sound barrier because he was immune to pain or fear. He broke it while experiencing both, proving that courage isn't the absence of fear or pain, it's action in spite of them. The sonic boom that rolled across the Mojave Desert that morning announced more than just the breaking of the sound barrier. It announced that humans would not be contained by the limitations that physics or circumstances seemed to impose. If a man with broken ribs could fly faster than sound using a broomstick to close his cockpit door, then perhaps no barrier was truly insurmountable. This is what the old breed of test pilots understood, what Chuck Yeager embodied that morning at 43,000 feet, that the difference between impossible and possible often comes down to the willingness to try, especially when every rational argument says you shouldn't. Did you know that Chuck Yeager kept the broken ribs secret for years after his historic flight? If this story of incredible determination resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that obstacles are meant to be overcome, not accepted. And don't forget to subscribe to the Old Breed channel, where we uncover the forgotten details of military history that remind us what humans are capable of achieving. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Yeager's position that morning? Would you have risked everything for a chance at history, or waited for the ribs to heal? Because sometimes the most important moments in human history hang on decisions made in pain, solutions improvised from whatever's at hand, and the simple refusal to let anything, not broken bones, not the sound barrier, not the word impossible, stand in the way of what needs to be done.